It's time for Rob McCulloch's From the Ivory Tower on mbr.co.nz. And Rob, you're throwing forward to next year's general election, but you're linking it with the past.
Yeah, I'm linking it with the Great Depression. And there's a reason for that because the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, linked our present problems to the Great Depression in his budget speech. So the reason he invoked the Great Depression was he said that if we want to get ourselves out of the problems we're in, there are lessons to be learned from how the Labour government of Michael Joseph Savage got the country out of the problems of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And the article is an argument that he's completely and utterly wrong. He's confused. He's missed the entire point about the nature of the shocks hitting New Zealand at the moment. They're supply side shocks. They're due to a shortage of labour, of skills. Oil obviously has gone up. There are supply chain issues. There are problems in the building industry, in the food industry. The Great Depression was completely different. It was a demand shock. It was a time when there was record high unemployment and deflation. Now is a time of record low unemployment and high inflation. So he's diagnosed the problem incorrectly, and the policies which he is adopting are wrong for the country.
You've described what they're planning to do as Bandaid Solutions.
Yeah. I mean, broadly speaking, the solutions which they're offering are similar to the sorts of solutions which were offered after the Great Depression. Those were correct at the time of the Great Depression, by the way, when there was record high unemployment. The creation of the welfare state was a tremendous thing to do. It was the right thing to do. But it's now the kinds of policies which Robertson wants to put in diametrically the wrong kinds of policies. And the sorts of policies he's advocating essentially are the policies of the national government under Rob Muldoon in the late 70s and early 80s. The Band-Aid is easy money, loose monetary policy, which has fueled inflation, and subsidies. That's what Rob Muldoon did in the 70s. And they got voted out in 1984 because the country rejected those policies.
So why aren't they putting forward some more concrete solutions and plans?
The problem is, I think it's a psychological problem. The problem is that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance have for decades of time consistently spoken about their complete and utter contempt for the supply side policies of the fourth Labour government from 1984 to 1989. Now, what are supply side policies? They're policies which are trying to lower costs, get more competition into the economy, pro-competition, pro-market. Consistently, over decades of time, the Prime Minister and Grant Robertson have argued against those policies. They've argued they increase inequality. They could not have shown a greater disdain for the policies of the fourth Labour government in the 80s. So we have a government that is completely unwilling to engage in reforms to the supply side of the economy to make things more competitive, to lower costs. In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're increasing costs. Policies like the fair wage, the new fair wage deal, which they're putting through, increasing union power at this time, increases in the minimum wage, wanting to introduce new payroll taxes. They're adding to cost pressures, they're not reducing them.
So you think they should wind those back?
The article is saying they're doing the wrong policies for the time that we are in. So those policies have a place. And after the Great Depression, many of these sorts of policies, which were the introduction of unemployment insurance, the welfare state, they were tremendous policies to do at a time when unemployment was 20%. They were the right thing to do. The government's got confused. They're the wrong thing to do now. We're at a time when you have to do radical supply side reforms for which the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance have repeatedly announced their complete and utter contempt for.
They've said, though, that a lot of these factors are global. What do you say to that?
Yes, and that's exactly the case. But by the way, that's an opinion. That's not a fact that they're global. They haven't done the analysis. The Treasury hasn't done the analysis. The Reserve Bank hasn't done the analysis. That's actually quite a complex economic problem to actually identify the causes of the problems we're in. So it's not necessarily global. We don't know yet the percentage of the, for example, increases in prices and inflation that is due to overseas factors, as opposed to the $50 billion money printing program of the Reserve Bank, extremely tight border controls that have been introduced the past couple of years. Many of our border controls, of course, were much stronger than many other countries. There are a whole bunch of domestic policies, the issues with the supermarket duopoly in our building industry. A lot of those issues are adding significantly to the cost of living, not to mention housing. So to assert it's overseas factors, that's actually a political statement. It's not a fact. It serves their political purposes to say they're due to foreign factors. By the way, in the 70s, the price of oil, which was a foreign factor, went up. And that was the reason primarily why in 1984, supply side reforms were embarked upon to try to lower costs and make the economy more competitive. But they don't want to do that now.
In terms of the general election, though, we're still probably 12 months out. What could happen between now and then in terms of all these pressures?
Well, it's clear what the government is hoping. They're hoping on blind luck. They've got their fingers crossed that these shocks from overseas will magically disappear. They're sort of hoping that maybe inflation will just magically go away on its own. That's what they're hoping. And in the meantime, they're hoping that implementing the sorts of policies that were done in the 1930s, 90 years ago, that is more subsidies, loose monetary policy, can somehow make people sort of feel good, their Band-Aids, without addressing the crux of the problem, lowering costs. We're in a supply side, we have a series of supply side shocks going on. They need to lower costs, to lower the standard, the cost of living, and to decrease inflation. They don't want to do those policies.
Will either party want to do that?
Well, the Nats, of course, did not do those policies in the late 70s and 80s. They got bundled out of office. Rob Muldoon ended up extremely unpopular. So the Nats have no history of doing supply side reforms themselves. My hunch is that both parties are terrified of being labelled neoliberal. There are these pejorative words that are being used, people who promote free market reforms, people that don't care about inequality, and sometimes they're pejoratively referred to as neoliberals. And I think that the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, and the leader of the National Party, also all of their brands, if you like, they're terrified that they will be polluted, if you like, with this word neoliberal. So they don't want to do pro-market reforms. They don't want to go down that kind of road, which are needed to lower costs. And they're looking for everything else they can do other than address the elephant in the room.
Rob McCulloch, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.